Bonsoir, everyone.
Bonsoir.
And just wait while everybody connects. So one more person, and then Anne, whenever you want to get started.
Okay. Bonsoir, bienvenue. My name is Anne. I'm going to make the presentation in English, but I know part of the discussion is going to take place in French as well. My name is Anne Leplay. I am the Executive Director of l'Alliance Française de Milwaukee, and I'm delighted to welcome you tonight to the presentation and discussion with Pauline Karroum and Dr. Edmund Ghareeb on Lebanon today and ways to help. Dr. Edmund Ghareeb is a Lebanese-American scholar at the American University in Washington and a professor at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Dr. Ghareeb has written extensively in English and Arabic on issues dealing with the Middle East, including the rise of new media and technology in the Middle East. He is the first Mustafa Barzani Distinguished Scholar in Global Kurdish Studies at the American University and introduced the first regular courses to be taught in the US on Kurdish history, politics, and culture. For several years, he coordinated the Middle East Studies program at American University. He also taught at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service in both Qatar and Washington, DC. Dr. Ghareeb is one of the first media analysts to recognize the potential revolutionary and transformational roles to be played by new media in the Arab world. And we're very happy to once again host Pauline Karroum to an Alliance Française event. Pauline was our guest in March and presented her first novel, She Lived in Sandwich. Pauline Karroum is a bilingual journalist who writes frequently in English and in French on news and analysis of the Middle East and North Africa. Pauline was born and raised in Lebanon and lived and worked in Paris. In 2011, she moved to the United States, and after living in Illinois, Georgia, and Tennessee, she now lives with her husband and her 2 children in Washington, DC. For more than 18 years, Pauline has written articles related to the Lebanese immigration, the history, and the diaspora news taking place in France and in the US. And recently she started covering the American relation with the Arab world and the American policy in the Middle East. So merci, bienvenue. Thank you for joining us today. And I'll pass the mic on to Pauline and Aaron.
Merci. Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you. Good evening, Erin. I would like to start by asking you, please, to introduce to us the situation in Lebanon by the audio and video that we're planning to do.
Hello, my name is Rula Azer Douglas. I am a journalist and fiction writer based in Beirut. The days are dark in Lebanon. I have never seen so much despair. Tens of thousands have lost their jobs or a huge part of their income in the last months. Since 2019, the Lebanese pound has lost almost 90% of its value. More than half of the population is poverty-stricken. Economic and social costs are overwhelming. A study conducted by the American University of Beirut estimated that a meal costs today 268% more than its cost in 2018. People had to replace food staples like meat, chicken, and fish with cheaper ones like lentils and rice. On the other hand, people suffer daily power cuts, a lack of safe drinking water, and limited public health care. Meanwhile, the ruling elite, who have failed to provide even basic services, have yet to agree a rescue plan or a new government since the outgoing administration quit on August 4th over the massive Beirut port explosion that killed more than 200 people, injured thousands, and left much of Beirut devastated.
So we heard it in the video, and Rula is a very like a colleague that is very serious, and she's been living in Lebanon for many years. She's describing what is happening today in Lebanon while we are in the United States. I wanted to emphasize on some points and some reality that the Lebanese people are facing today. According to the World Bank, more than 50% of Lebanon, nearly 7 million people live below the poverty. In excess of 1.5 million are in extreme poverty. Before the crisis, many persons in need used to earn the equivalent of around 300, enough for the family to get by. This time last year, when the currency began to plummet, the salary dropped to $70 a month. Today, it's $37, just over $1 a day. According to the American University of Beirut Crisis Observatory, in just a year, the price of food here has been up by 350%. Politically, Lebanon's officials and politicians have been raising the specter of internal conflict whenever the government corruption is discussed. Months is over between Prime Minister designated Saad Hariri and President Michel Aoun. There is still no agreement about the future of governance in the country. The only hope is the possibility or maybe the opportunity of an imminent political resolution, which in turn produce an efficient and an effective government. But now this seems like a dream. In the absence of leadership, the economy could continue to hurtle towards the unknown. So tonight, I want to discuss with Dr. Ghareeb the situation in Lebanon. He's been covering and studying the situation in Lebanon for many years. My first question is, Dr. Ghareeb, why are we today in those dark moments in Lebanon?
Thank you, Pauline. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Erin, and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's a pleasure to be with Pauline, whom I met a few years ago, and when she interviewed me about the Arab American experience, some of the writers who led a what you might call a renaissance in Arabic writing, as well as to a certain extent, they also, some of them wrote in English. Probably one of them you might know, his name, Gibran, who's probably Gibran Khalil Gibran, who's the author of The Prophet, who probably was the third bestseller in the United States. Millions of copies of his book sold. His books were translated to 104 languages worldwide, and and he actually came when he was very young from Lebanon. He was, he caught the attention of an American librarian and director of a school who appreciated the intelligence of this young boy, and later on she helped him study and helped even finance his study in France. He studied under the sculpture under Rodin in Paris, and then he went to Lebanon, studied Arabic again. Then he came to the US. So that's how I got to know Pauline, and I very much came to admire her work and basically her interests in the Arab American community and in what's going on in the US. As to the question of what's happening in Lebanon, in many ways, what we have seen in Lebanon is that Lebanon has been on the brink for a long time. Lebanon, as you know, basically it's a small country. It's divided sometimes by sectarianism. It's very poor. In fact, it's an ancient land. For thousands of years, people from Lebanon have left and gone to traveled and explored and traded all over the known world. We all know about the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians came from Lebanon, actually, although they did stretch beyond the borders of the current Lebanon into partly into Syria and into Palestine, what's today also Israel. So but that's where the Phoenicians came from. They were the first people to use the modern alphabet, actually. I don't know how many of you know, but there is a story, an ancient story, that the god Zeus kidnapped the daughter of the king of Sidon, Europa, and and he took her with her back to Greece, and to her brother Cadmus went looking for her, and that he's the one who taught the alphabet, gave the alphabet to the Greeks. So you have the alphabets came from that modern alphabet from the Greeks, and but it originally came from Lebanon, and also the name of Europe came from Lebanon as well. It's interesting that he would go all the way to Lebanon to find a wife or a woman that he wanted to be with. But the other important thing about the Phoenicians also that is very significant here is that, and here I'm going to go a little bit into history, is that they were the best navigators in the ancient world. In fact, there's a story that the Phoenicians may have discovered America long before Leif Erikson and Columbus. Now there have been there's a rock that in Brazil where there is some writing in the Phoenician alphabet saying that a ship strayed from a group of ships that were sent by the Phoenician king to do some work for the Pharaoh of Egypt who wanted to have a survey around the coast of Africa at that time, and that's what they did, and they wrote a report for him. But what this story says that one of the ships ended up in what's today's Brazil, and also there are reports that there may be there were writings on the rock in Colorado, in Utah and in New England. Regardless of whether this is accurate or not, there's no doubt that the Phoenicians were among the first traders. They established settlements. They traded with Greece, established settlements in Libya, and Carthage, of course, is very famous, in North Africa and Spain, in parts of Europe, Italy, as well, all the way to Britain and Ireland. So the history, the relationship between Europe and Lebanon is very old. As to also some of the other things that are about Lebanon is that what made it unique in a way. Lebanon, in fact, was one of the first countries to establish relations in the Middle East with Europe. Of course, after the Crusades and in the 15th century, there were contacts between the Lebanese prince who ruled Mount Lebanon. Actually, he ruled a much larger area at that time, Fakhreddin al-Mani, that was his name. And he established ties with France and with the Vatican. And there were a lot of missionaries that went there. In fact, the Catholic French and Italian missionaries helped establish the printing press. And Lebanon was the center of education. Lebanon was the center of free press in much of the Arab world, and to a certain extent, although there has been a decline since recent times, but in many parts of the Arab world, the first publications even in Egypt, Al-Ahram, which is the leading paper still publishing in Egypt, was established by Lebanese journalists. So did actually papers and magazines all over the region. The first books that were printed in the Middle East were in Lebanon, printed in Lebanon. The first were religious texts. The Bible, the Protestant Bible, was also printed in Beirut. Dr. Van Dyke, who used to be at the American University of what is now the American University of Beirut, as well as Boutros Boustany, who was a Lebanese writer who helped him. Also, the Catholic Bible was printed in Arabic in Lebanon as well, the first. And later Arabic literature and Arabic historical works were first published in Lebanon long before, almost 200 years before they were published in other areas. But Lebanon at the same time also was, what made it unique in part was that it was a refuge for many minorities, particularly one of the first minorities that were the Maronites, or later would join with the Catholic Church and accept the leadership of the Pope, although they maintained their liturgy, their own liturgy, and Aramaic language, the Syriac language that Jesus spoke. They fled from, in the 5th, 6th centuries, from the Byzantine Empire because of religious differences, and to Mount Lebanon, and they maintained, and they were mostly in northern Lebanon, but later on they began to expand and went beyond northern Lebanon. But Lebanon was also the home of other minorities, particularly the Shiites, who were a persecuted minority, the Druze, also other communities. So that's what makes Lebanon a unique country, although it suffered as a result of this diversity. In fact, one of the first reasons why we began to see a lot of problems in Lebanon was that in the 1860s, in fact, we saw 1860, there were massacres. There was a sort of a civil war between the Druze and the Christian communities. Many Christians were massacred, and that was one of the main reasons why, in fact, many Lebanese Christians, in addition to, and not just the Christians, later on also a lot of Muslims began to immigrate to South America and to North America. That immigration began. The first person, of course, to come from that region was a Catholic Chaldean priest from Iraq who was to the Vatican, and the Vatican sent him in the early part of the 17th century to do a report on America. And he did that. He wrote a report after about staying in the Americas for about 12 years in Latin and in Arabic. But the first Lebanese to come to the United States was around 1832. Around 1838, was a Catholic Melkite priest who came to get some financial support to help his monastery. And then a Protestant young man came who studied at what was known at that time as the Syrian Protestant College, and later became known as the American University of Beirut. Came to the United States. He was brilliant, but he got sick after a few years and died. And then the first family to arrive in the United States was in the 1870s as a family. And from then onward, we began to see sort of a flood. And as I said, the reasons were, some of it was because they heard about the United States. American missionaries made it to Lebanon. The first missionary was by the name of Pliny. He was in Lebanon in 1820, and then left and then came back 1823. And then they began to, the main purpose initially was to convert Muslims to Christianity, although they ended up converting Eastern Christians to Western forms of Christianity or sects. But they played a very important role in building schools, So they started the first school for women in Lebanon. I think it was around 1835. They later established the Syrian Protestant College, which later on became known as, changed its name to the American University of Beirut, and was and still is probably the best known and university in the region. And it attracted students from all over the world, from all over the Middle East, even from the United States, from Europe, from Afghanistan. In fact, the current president of Afghanistan was a graduate of the AUB, and so American University, and so is actually the American envoy to Afghanistan, Khalilzad, is a graduate of AUB. And there are many of the leaders. When the UN was founded, the largest number of graduates who participated in creating the UN were graduates of the American University of Beirut, more than any university in the world. So this is in itself is something that, just to give you some background, but the point is that I also wanted to mention about this is that the Lebanese went through a very difficult time during the First World War, because the people of the war, the Ottomans, closed the borders, and they stole the food, basically because they wanted to feed their soldiers, the grains and the food of many Lebanese. Many Lebanese died of hunger, thousands and thousands of people at that time. And in addition to that, then came the locusts. They finished what the Turks didn't finish. But after the war, what we saw, Lebanon, after the civil war that I had talked about in 1960, Lebanon was recognized as an autonomous region in the Ottoman Empire that would be run, because of French and other European intervention, that it would be run by a Christian Ottoman subject, because of this mix and makeup of the country. So what ended up happening is that after the war, France was the country that had mandatory powers for Lebanon and Syria. And Lebanon was established partly because of the demands, mainly by Lebanese Christian Maronites and others as well, to have an independent state. For the original intention was for Christians and other minorities who were there, and of course later on became independent after the Second World War. And for a while, the Lebanese system appeared to be working. The government was established to have a weak central government, not to have a strong military. The president was supposed to be a Maronite Christian. The prime minister would be a Sunni Muslim, because at that time, the majority, the Christians were probably around 55% of the population. The Muslims were probably around 45%, but Lebanon had 18 different sects. They have, in addition to the Christian Maronites, there are Melkites, Greek Catholics, they are called, there are Greek Orthodox, there are Nestorians, there are Assyrians, there are Chaldeans. These are all Eastern Christian rites. There are Armenian Christians as well, and so you have, and then with the Muslim side, you have, of course, the two major sects, the Sunni and the Shiite, and then you have the Druze community, which some people sometimes they consider themselves Muslims, sometimes they don't, and so do the Alawi community also. So it was this diversity made Lebanon in many ways unique, but it contributed to the politics of identity that unfortunately we're seeing now in the United States as well. And that has led to fierce struggles in Lebanon. But also Lebanon, because of its diversity, because of this press, because of the educated population, for a while, it was basically, it was for up until the early 70s, Beirut was and Lebanon were considered the Switzerland of the Middle East. And it was the banking center, the educational center, cultural center, the media center, all was in Beirut. Many foreign countries established banks, had branches in Lebanon, and Lebanon was sort of the door to the Middle East, to the United States, and to some of the European powers. But then the first conflict, the first civil war started in 1958. It started with the assassination of a Lebanese editor of a newspaper. Partly it was because of the struggle that was going on in the region between those who were favored the West, and the Lebanese president and his government at that time wanted to, he accepted the Eisenhower Pact and wanted to join the Baghdad Pact, but there was opposition from nationalists, Arab nationalists. Some of the Muslim groups were supported by Egypt at that time. And so Lebanon, in a way, from then on, became a victim of its history and of its neighborhood, of its environment, and of its makeup, because sectarianism was used as a weapon by one group against the other. And Lebanon entered into civil war. The US intervened in 1958, and then a new president was accepted, Fuad Shahab. And then for a while, the situation was quiet, but it got much worse later on in the late 60s, early 70s, especially as the Palestinians who became refugees, and Lebanon had hosted something like 400,000 to 500,000 refugees. They began to organize to fight against Israel, and Lebanon was seen as Lebanon and Jordan were the first two countries where you had strong Palestinian military forces organizing to fight to regain Palestine, and that led to in part to civil war in Jordan in 1970, and where they were lost, and many of them ended up in Lebanon. Again, more Palestinians, and then we saw this struggle in 1975, a war which lasted up until 1990. And in that war, Lebanon was also again the victim of its environment, of its geography. Lebanese they tell a joke that when God decided to divide the territories among the people of the region, that after that territory was divided, that some of the groups went to him and asked him. He said, "Why do you, why do you favor the Lebanese against us? You gave them a long coastline, almost 200 kilometers of coast. You gave them high mountains. You gave them a fertile valley, and you gave us, mainly deserts or very arid areas. So why the favoritism?" So he said, "Wait until you see the neighbors I'm giving them." And so, and this basically Lebanon, you have on the one side, you have the Israelis, on the other side, you have basically the Syrians. And Lebanon is a very difficult position. And so Lebanon became an arena for the conflicts that took place in the region, not between the Arab countries themselves, between the Arab countries and Israel. And we saw this bloody conflict. Over 145,000 Lebanese were killed in that war. And there were also some of those who were missing. And that's out of a country of about 4 million people. So that gives you an idea of how bloody, how difficult that war was. And that war ended up also in 900,000 Lebanese immigrating, leaving Lebanon. And some of these were the best educated people, the doctors, lawyers, not all of them, of course, but many of the professionals ended up leaving. Some went to Australia, some went to the Gulf, some went to the United States, Canada, and many other countries for a while. And then we had a change in the in the constitution. There was an agreement that was organized by Saudi Arabia. There was a conference held in Saudi Arabia and attended by many of the Lebanese factions. It weakened the power of the president. That gave more authority to the prime minister and sort of also divided the positions in the government among the sects, 50-50, although it was divided in reality. It ended up being close to a third to the Christians, third to the Shiite Muslims and a third to the Sunnis. Of course, there were the other sects, certain positions left to them. And then what we ended up seeing is from that time onwards, there was a deterioration of the situation in Lebanon. We saw there was this fight. We saw afterwards the rise also of Hezbollah, which is a Shiite political party that is fought to get rid of the Israeli occupation of Lebanon in 1982, 83. But really in 2006, they succeeded in forcing the Israelis out of Lebanon, but that gave them a lot of authority. They were also backed by Iran, which has its own interests in the area. And as a result, they have emerged today as probably the single most powerful political group in the country, and they have a great deal of influence. They are now, there are reports that they have organized, for example, to provide food and medicine to some of their, usually as expected, to their own communities. But when there was criticism of that made in the press and the media, they said that it's not just to their own community. They will give it to some of the other communities as well, and they were just preparing in case things collapse or the Lebanese state collapse, and so they had to be prepared. So, but this is a sign, an indication of the nature of the problem. In addition to the political conflicts that Lebanon has witnessed, we began around 2005 to see assassinations. The Lebanese prime minister was assassinated. Later, there was a great deal of mismanagement by the Lebanese leaders at the government at that time. We saw there was a waste management disaster which poisoned the air in Lebanon. Then we saw fires that burned many areas of the forests in the Lebanese mountains. And that was disastrous also for a small country like Lebanon. Some politicians signed secret agreements for money to store nuclear waste in Lebanon also, and that was another terrible story. In addition to that, of course, we saw we saw high unemployment. We saw the government beginning to borrow money. They spent the last, I would say, 15 to 20 years, the government was borrowing money from the central bank. They were spending $7 billion more than they were getting into the government treasury. And so that meant that what they did is they borrowed the money, although in reality they didn't pay it back, and I don't know if they even intended to pay it back. And so what you have today is basically that money. The central bank is obligated, according to the law, to give that money to the government, to the state. And that's what they did. But since they didn't have all that money, they began to take money from some of the banks. And that's where, because many people from outside Lebanon, as well as many Lebanese, were depositing their savings in these banks. And now they have lost, many of them have lost all of that. I remember when I was in Lebanon, I went back to Lebanon and took some courses in Beirut. The dollar equaled, it was equivalent to 2.5 to 3.25 Lebanese pounds. A few months ago, the dollar was $1 equal to close to 14,000 Lebanese pounds. And at one point, it even reached close to 15,000. And that gives you an idea. So people lost their savings, the value of the currencies, even their income, whether it was working for the government or even business or what they lost, as was mentioned in the report that we heard earlier, about 90% of the money. So all of this, and then on top of it came the explosion that almost devastated Beirut. In the port, the government or the port authority had allowed ammonium nitrate, something like 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate to be kept at the port. They were taken off a ship that had problems in Lebanon around 2014. And despite requests to dispose of this ammonium nitrate, nothing was done. And so when the explosion took place, hundreds of people died, close to 7,000 people were wounded, and 300,000 people or thereabout were made homeless. And this is on top of all the problems that Lebanon is facing. And so as a result of this, Lebanon is in many ways, it is a small, divided, precarious country, small population, despite its importance, basically of the role it has played as a cultural center, also as Lebanon was the country which always welcomed political dissidents, political refugees as well. But at the same time, the problems, the divisions among the sects in Lebanon and the corruption of the politicians and all of them. That's why we saw in last year, again, a resumption of the protests where people from all sects came down to the streets seeking change of government, but then thugs got in and they began to beat the protests, and that more or less ended it, despite efforts to continue. And so this is the current situation that we have today, and you have the high unemployment, you have poverty. For the first time, the number of poverty people were in Lebanon below the poverty line. It was about 26%. Now it's probably around 53, 54%, and still rising. The number of people who are unemployed is unbelievable. For the first time, you're hearing about hunger. People are going hungry. Lebanon also has 1 million to 1.5 million Syrian refugees. It has the highest per capita of refugees of any country in the world. I mean, Lebanon's population, as I said, probably 4 million or 4.25, something like that. And so when you have almost 2 million refugees, that's almost half of the population. And that also has been an added burden. Recently also, many Lebanese who used to work in the Gulf, for example, the Gulf was shut down, some of it because of this conflict that we're talking about, because of they were very angry with the Lebanese government's policies, especially, and with Hezbollah, and that has also been a problem. The Western countries are now considering sanctions. The US has imposed sanctions, although sanctions while they are aimed, or if they are targeted towards individuals, certain figures, that could be understandable. But when it affects the populations, the average people, and usually that's what these are the people who are affected by the sanctions. And it's a very blunt weapon, and usually the weakest and the poorest of the population are the ones who are hurt the most. But in Lebanon now, what the situation, I'm not just talking about the sanctions, but because of all of what we talked about, the causes, you have both the poor as well as the middle class also now. Lebanon used to have a healthy middle class, strong, large, relatively speaking, middle class. And the middle class now is really paying a heavy price. And people are beginning to sell their homes, their apartments, their land, if they have land, and try to buy tickets and leave the country again. And that is another tragedy that's facing Lebanon and the Lebanese.
Thank you, Edmund. I think that we are all also, like, we knew how much the situation is really bad, but thank you for explaining how exactly that really started and why today we are completely here. Now, I think that it's the time maybe to ask you if you have some questions or some clarification regarding what have been said so far, then we can answer your questions.
If anyone wants to unmute, or Nancy?
And James.
I'll just ask this. I mean, given all the catastrophic things that Lebanon had to endure, I wonder if you would, how how were they and the refugee camps and so forth struck in this last year by COVID, which seems like one more catastrophe?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And Lebanon has been very hard hit. Not only the refugee, although the refugees probably are in a worse shape than the average Lebanese, but the whole country has suffered. There's a lack of the vaccine. There is, one of the problems now that I've just recently read about. I saw some interviews with some doctors in Lebanon, and many of them are saying they're going to leave. They're going to immigrate because they said if we cannot provide medicine, if we cannot take care of our patients, what are we doing? We cannot stay here, and they don't have medicine. That's another big problem. There is an attempt to get some support. In the past, you used to have also UNRWA, for example, with Palestinian refugees, used to provide some help, and but they lost some funding and under President Trump, and so that affected also the situation there. But now it seems that funding is going to come back. This will help. It will help us, especially with the Palestinian refugees. There was some aid also given to the Syrian refugees through the UN. Some countries also gave through private assistance. That helped. In Lebanon, in terms of the rest of the population, as I said, usually those who were well off, those who had money, were able to get some well connected. They were able to get the vaccine, but not the rest. There are efforts now to bring in vaccines, and there are some countries also in Europe and beyond the Russians have all sent some also some vaccines. The French, I read an article that they are also sending some vaccines, as well as some other European countries. But the situation is not very good. A lot of people, again, are suffering. In fact, I've just a couple of weeks ago, I heard from a cousin of mine who had just passed away from COVID, and so it's a real problem.
And actually, Nancy, the situation also is that usually the doctors are those who leave Lebanon. That's like this history of the Lebanese diaspora, and now it's getting worse and worse. They're really, really leaving the country. Like there is almost like really any doctor who can leave the country now is leaving to France, Australia, or Lebanon, or Canada. Is not staying in Lebanon.
I think James had a question.
Your answer, the question on the basis of your answer to Nancy's question, Mr. Ghareeb. I was wondering, for kind of selfish professional reasons,
Could you speak a little louder, please?
Can you, can you raise your voice?
Okay. Is this good? I kind of.
Better, yes, thank you.
Okay, all right, sorry. I was wondering if you might be able to speak to the status of mental health services in Lebanon. It seems like it's an area that's suffered so much trauma. I was wondering if you happen to know like how mental health services are provided in Lebanon.
I think maybe Pauline might know.
Yeah,
more
I
about
actually
this
James, I want to thank you for this question, because now there is a study that is conducted within the United States by researchers that are here, with researchers that are in Lebanon. They're doing a very big research asking the population in Lebanon, and particularly also in the diaspora, the expatriates, how are they feeling after the explosions and the impact. And studies are not like this particular study is not yet, like the results are not published, but there is a lot of like awareness of the importance of that. So yeah, that's also part. If you know any Lebanese that will be interested to answer the questions, please let me know, because I can forward this research that is like going on within the Lebanese network within the US and also in Europe.
In addition to what Pauline was mentioning, by the way, there has been a number, this problem really, we saw it beginning clearly and on large numbers of people during the Civil War between 1975 and 1990. Well, it was not just a civil war. Actually, the number of foreign participants in the Lebanese conflict at that time was larger than the Lebanese combatants. But that's neither here nor there. But the point is that that's when you really began to see it. And recently, I've seen a couple of stories talking about the increase in the number of suicides in Lebanon, including especially among young people. And sometimes you saw it also among even, like there was, I just read a story, and that was one of the examples that were given about the head of a family who couldn't buy food for his children. So basically he committed suicide.
I think that really we are in front of the situation where you had a middle class living in Lebanon, and that doesn't exist no more. Like you're in a situation where you have really very rich people that took the money from the population, basically, and poor people that are living in the same country. We don't have any middle class no more. Middle class that I am a result of, for instance, like just to say how much we emphasize on the importance of this particular class in any country.
Dr. Ghareeb, you're an expert on the influence of new media in the Middle East. What role has new media played in Lebanon today, and its relationship with the rest of the world?
That's a great question.
That's a great question.
One of the things that you began to see, as I said, Lebanon was for a long time was the center of education and of the press. The first newspaper to be published in the region was in Lebanon. And by the way, even today, for example, you have English language newspapers published in Lebanon. You have two, I think. Maybe Pauline can correct me if I am wrong on this. And there's one or two, I think at least one that Pauline used to write for, and maybe still does, L'Orient Le Jour.
Yeah.
Is there another French language newspaper?
No, but actually now L'Orient Le Jour, which is a French newspaper, which used to be still a French newspaper, has an English edition too.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you had Armenian, you had Italian, and then you had large numbers. Lebanon at one time used to have 70. A city like Beirut had something like 70 newspapers published in different languages, and they were ranged from the extreme left to the extreme right and everything in between. Well, but with the rise of new governments, with the rise of conflicts after independence, you began to see governments, especially in the neighboring areas, impose censorship. For example, if there's an article they didn't like in that paper, they would stop the paper from a Lebanese paper going to their country. Or they would sometimes they would cut a picture or a story, and then they would allow the rest of the paper to go in. And that began to have an effect. And you also began to see foreign money, from Arab countries, including from the US, by the way, and from some of the European countries at one time that felt they had interest because of the influence of the Lebanese press. They would help contribute money to help this paper. And sometimes some of those papers would advance policies and support policies favoring that country. And so that was a problem that also began to emerge. But as the censorship mounted, for example, with TV, and radio, you began to have a real problem, because in the beginning, you could not get, they would be blocked. Like if you had Lebanese television could not be even rare. Very rarely could you see it in some cities in Syria, for example, partly because it was blocked, and also because the technology at that during the early days was a little bit still underdeveloped. But that was one of the problems. But however, with radio and with the you began to see a real new weapon, a new media. We saw this. Egypt was the first country to use this. There was a special radio which appealed under President Nasser. It started in the 50s and it still is actually till today, but it has changed and it no longer plays that same role. So what you have, that radio channel, and it was called Sawt al-Arab, the voice of the Arabs. And it actually popularized Japanese transistor radios in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf region, because the American radios, which were sold at that time in Saudi Arabia, could not get the voice of the Arabs, and people wanted to listen to that radio station. So the power of radio and television, but the real development began to change when the civil war took place in Lebanon. You ended up seeing many of the newspapers, they no longer had supporters, they didn't have many readers, they didn't have advertisers, so they started shutting down. And some of them moved to France or to England. And so like two of Lebanon's major newspapers ended up in London. There were some of the magazines, and Mustaqbal magazine and others ended up in France, and they published from there. And they tried to get their publications to the rest of the Arab world, but they continued to face problems and censorship. However, with the new information technology, the revolution and the emergence of television that could go across the borders, we began to see the emergence of three networks. First, there was one in Lebanon called LBC, Lebanese Broadcasting Corporation, LBCI International, which had a wide audience in Lebanon, and they were the first radio and television channel basically to be broadcast discussions and bringing diverse points of view and talk shows and about politics, about the economy, and they did it generally. Of course, they had their own perspective, but overall, they also invited people from different backgrounds. This also happened in began to appear in the new television channels that began to emerge. One of them out of London called MBC, backed by the Saudis. They spent almost $800 million on that channel before it moved to Dubai. And there was a war, also a propaganda war between, at that time, Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and between Egypt and some of the other neighbors. And there was also a new channel that emerged that, to a certain extent, revolutionized the whole coverage. Two new ones. One was Al Arabiya TV, again pro-Saudis, but it was very modern, very sophisticated. There were more diverse views than you get from Saudi television.
I think
And then
Edmund, sorry, I'm so sorry to.
Al Jazeera. That's it. And I'll stop.
Sorry, so sorry. I don't want to interrupt you.
No,
It's just that
problem.
I was worried first to leave before saying thank you so much for hosting the event, l'Alliance Française Milwaukee, to say thank you for being with us tonight. And also really like I added in the chat, if you are, if you want to know how to help, if you're interested, please reach out. There are many ways. I will myself consider the Lebanese Mothers of the Diaspora, which is a part initiative that is by mothers from the diaspora to mothers in Lebanon. They goes directly. There is directly to them. There is an association that is called Cezobel that has been working in Lebanon, and that is special for people special needs and their families. It has been working for 40 years, so they have the experience. They are in the United States. If you want to help, please let us know. Send an email maybe to Erin. She will forward that to me, and I'll try to help as much as I can. really sending to the people involved with all those like association or institutions. I just want to say thank you so much and have a great night. I'll have to leave you now. Bye-bye. Thank you so much. Bye.
Well, thank you. And I add my voice to Pauline. In addition, there is also the Red Cross, the Lebanese Red Cross would be another avenue if anybody wants to help.
And feel free to email Aaron or I, and we can forward this information. I believe we're recording this, right, Aaron? And so we'll be able to forward it if anyone wants. Pauline had to leave, but Dr. Ghareeb is still here if you have more questions.
Thank you.
Comments.
Just want to say thank you. It's very moving to hear the summary of the difficulties. I feel like, yes, the question is obvious, how can we help? But also, what do you think, in Lebanon, the single thing that would be most useful, would you think, would you focus on corruption, or would you focus on the banking, or what thing would help the most?
Two areas. By the way, there's there was a very interesting article. Let me see if I have it a while back, written by an former American ambassador to Morocco. He basically was suggesting to the U.S. Government, and because recently the Undersecretary of State David Hale went to Beirut and met with some of the Lebanese leaders and trying to see what the U.S. could help. On the one hand, this was to try to pressure the political leaders to try to reach an agreement. They haven't been able to form a government for 8 months.
Right.
And that's in itself is a tragedy. So that's one of the main things. But you put your finger on something that's very important, because what the real problem is, because on the one hand, there is a lot of corruption. The leaders, the top echelons, even though they claim to each one to be defending a certain sector, a certain community, and to represent their interests, they're really representing their own interests. You find that many of these political leaders, they became multimillionaires, and one wonders where some of them, since some of them didn't inherit money, where did they get all that money from? While the people have a lot of problems. The second, which is there is a need for a new contract, social contract in Lebanon, basically to try to reduce the emphasis on sectarianism, sects, and to try to create a new kind of identity-based, a more secular identity, a more liberal identity, tolerant identity. We take into account also the changes that have taken place. On the one hand, yes, you can still, if you want to maintain say the president would be a Christian and the prime minister, that's fine. But everybody else below them, they should be basically based on people, they're selected for their positions based not on their sect and their religion, but on their qualification. That is something very important. The second thing is that people who commit acts of corruption, who steal money, who abuse their authority, they should be held to account. The Lebanese press used to play a big role, but it has lost some of its influence. The third point is that's where perhaps it's going to be difficult, but that's where maybe if the European countries and others as well become involved to try to reduce or stop the the interference in Lebanon's internal affairs. That's another thing, because many of these countries in the region, we saw the war going on between Saudi Arabia and Egypt in the 50s, 60s, early 70s. And Lebanon was one of the main arenas. We saw a conflict between Syria and its supporters, and Israel on the other hand, and the Palestinians fought on Lebanese soil, and the Lebanese ended up paying the price. Then we saw conflict between Syria and Iraq. being fought in Lebanese territory. And there was also the conflict at one time of Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. That also at one time had its impact on Lebanon. And more recently, it's Iran, for example, and the Saudis on the one hand. And the Israelis, although the Israelis don't have a great deal of direct influence in Lebanon, although they have intervened, launched wars a couple of times that were devastating, in fact. But it was the war between the Saudis and their allies and the Iranians and their allies is being waged also on Lebanese territory. Syria intervened with the help and the blessing of the United States and not one even of the Israeli leadership, and were there for almost a decade. That also, had devastating impact on Lebanese society. So it's all of these. This is where perhaps not, while it's important to right now immediately try to resolve, first prevent Lebanon from becoming a failed country. Secondly, to help financially to restore, at least begin to allow a certain level of stability and provide assistance to the people who are really, truly in need. But then the important thing is to try to stop the interference in the country's internal affairs by supporting this group or that group, and try to allow the Lebanese to develop, create their own social contract, because there are some important people who in the country who are knowledgeable, who had good ideas where the country should move to. And I think maybe one of the things that might be very good is to have for the next cabinet should be maybe a government of technocrats rather than a government representing specific sects or political parties or clans. And that would be also a step in the right direction.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you have any other questions? Well, you don't see anyone, so.
Well, if there's no one, if you have any more questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But thank you very much for your kind invitation. This was a pleasure, great questions, and thank you for your interest.
Thank you so much for giving us so much information in such a short time on such a important topic these days.
Thank you.
And a country that's such a Francophile. We've had many teachers who've come through who are from Lebanon.
Well, Lebanon, by the way, also has been very close to France. The French language is still spoken by at least half of the Lebanese, although English is gaining a little bit. But there has been this strong bond for centuries, actually, between the French people, the French and the Lebanese people. And France has played an important role in the history of Lebanon in terms of providing some support for schools, education, health, etc. And that, I think, was very, very important.
Thank
Great.
you.
And I know a lot of other people who couldn't make it were interested, so we'll get the recording around. So
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a good evening.
Have a good night.
Thank you.